Some last stands were not desperate accidents. They were decisions made in full knowledge of the odds. Wooden shields locked in a mountain pass. A wooden hand carried into a farmhouse siege. A ridge above a river, where two very different stories were both true at once, and only one of them made it into your textbook. Thermopylae. In August 480 BCE, King Leonidas of Sparta leads roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers to block a narrow mountain pass in central Greece, the only route for a Persian army under King Xerxes to reach the south. For 2 days the pass holds. Persian numbers, likely in the hundreds of thousands, cannot force their way through men fighting shoulder to shoulder with shields locked. But a local man named Ephialtes reveals a hidden goat path around the mountain, and Persian soldiers begin circling behind the Greek line. Leonidas sends most of his army away to fight another day, and keeps roughly 300 Spartans, along with soldiers from Thespia and Thebes, to hold the pass alone. They know the outcome already. They fight anyway, buying time for the retreat behind them. By the third day, Leonidas is dead, and the last defenders are overrun. The battle becomes propaganda before the bodies are cold, carved onto a stone marker that still stands at the site today. No one can say what would have happened if that goat path had stayed hidden. Rorke's Drift. You are standing at a small mission station on the Buffalo River in what is now South Africa on the evening of January 22nd, 1879. Word arrives that a Zulu army has just destroyed a much larger British force a few hours away at Isandlwana. Roughly 150 British and colonial soldiers, many of them sick or wounded, hold the station under Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead. There is no time to retreat and nowhere safe to run. The men stack biscuit boxes and grain sacks into makeshift walls and wait. Through the night, a Zulu force of several thousand warriors attacks the station again and again, and the fighting turns into close combat inside burning buildings. Inside the hospital building, defenders break through interior walls with a pickaxe to drag patients out room by room as the thatched roof burns above them. By morning, the defenders are still standing, and the Zulu force withdraws. The battle earned 11 Victoria Crosses, the most ever awarded for a single action in British military history, from a garrison small enough to fit inside a school gymnasium. Wake Island. In December 1941, this is a tiny Pacific atoll, barely large enough for an airstrip, defended by around 450 United States Marines and a handful of Navy personnel under Major James Devereux. 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese ships arrive to take the island in what commanders expect to be a quick operation. Wake's defenders open fire from coastal guns hidden until the last moment and sink a Japanese destroyer, forcing the first invasion fleet to withdraw. It is one of the only clear American victories in the war's first weeks. Reinforcements never arrive. A second, much larger invasion force returns 2 weeks later, and after a day of fighting across the beaches, Devereux orders a white flag raised to stop the killing. More than 1,000 civilian construction workers on the island are captured alongside the Marines, and many spend the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps. Newspapers back home turned Wake into a symbol before it even fell, asking in headlines whether the Marines could hold. Whether faster reinforcement could have saved the island is still argued by historians today. Camaron. How does a company of 65 men stand against a force of 2,000? On April 30th, 1863, in the Mexican state of Veracruz, this unit of the French Foreign Legion, under Captain Jean d'Anjou, is escorting a supply convoy when Mexican cavalry and infantry surround them near the village of Camaron. D'Anjou pulls his men into a walled farmhouse and refuses every offer to surrender. He lost his left hand years earlier in an accident and fights with a wooden prosthetic strapped to his arm. Through the day, the legionnaires hold the farmhouse walls against wave after wave of attackers, and by afternoon, d'Anjou is dead and food and water are gone. The last handful of survivors fix bayonets and charge into the open rather than surrender, and Mexican officers, stunned by what they have just watched, let the final 3 men keep their weapons as they are taken prisoner. The Legion still parades d'Anjou's wooden hand through the streets of Aubagne every April 30th, the oldest surviving relic in French military tradition, carried by an officer in a ceremony that has continued for more than a century. Masada. You climb a narrow path up a sheer rock plateau rising above the Dead Sea in the Judean desert, toward a fortress King Herod built more than a century earlier as a private refuge. By the year 73 CE, this is the last holdout of Jewish rebels after Rome has crushed the revolt everywhere else and burned the temple in Jerusalem. Roman legions under Flavius Silva besiege the plateau for months and finally build a massive earthen ramp up its western face, dragging a siege tower and battering ram to the walls. According to the ancient historian Josephus, the rebel leader Eleazar ben Yair convinces the defenders that death by their own hand is better than slavery, and when Roman soldiers finally break through, they find the fortress silent, the defenders already dead by mutual agreement rather than by Roman swords. Modern archaeologists have found only a handful of skeletons on the site, far fewer than the 960 people Josephus describes, and some historians now question how much of his account can be trusted. No one has resolved whether Masada ended in mass suicide or simply in silence. Little Bighorn. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer leads roughly 210 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry along a ridge above the Little Bighorn River in Montana, expecting to find a small camp he can scatter easily. Instead, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by figures including Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, are camped along the valley below, defending their families and their land from a United States government trying to force them onto reservations. Custer splits his regiment and attacks anyway. Within roughly an hour, his detachment is surrounded on open, exposed hills with no cover and no way out, and every soldier with him is killed. For decades afterward, American textbooks and paintings framed Custer as a martyred hero cut down defending civilization. Native accounts of the same battle describe a defense of their own homeland against an army that had already broken previous treaties. Both descriptions are of the same afternoon. Historians still argue whether the outcome would have looked any different if Custer had waited one more day for the rest of his regiment to catch up. Shiroyama. By September 1877, Saigo Takamori commands what is left of a rebel samurai army on a single hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima in southern Japan, down to around 500 men armed largely with swords and old muskets. Saigo had once helped build the modern Japanese state himself, but broke with the government over its rush to abolish the samurai class and modernize the army along western lines. Now that same government surrounds Shiroyama with roughly 30,000 troops carrying modern rifles and artillery. Saigo's men dig in on the hillside anyway, knowing the numbers make the outcome certain. Government forces shell the position for days before the final assault, and Saigo is badly wounded in the fighting that follows. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say a follower ended his life to spare him capture. Others say he died of his wounds on the hillside. Within a generation, the government that killed him restored his reputation, and his statue now stands in a park in Tokyo. No one knows for certain how the last samurai died. Chosin Reservoir. You are dug into frozen ground beside a mountain reservoir in North Korea in late November 1950, where temperatures fall to nearly 40 degrees below zero, and rifles freeze solid in soldiers' hands. Close to 30,000 United States and Allied troops under Major General Oliver Smith find themselves surrounded by well over 100,000 Chinese soldiers who have crossed the border in secret to enter the war. Retreat is not really an option, because the only road out runs for dozens of miles through mountain passes the Chinese army already controls. Smith refuses to call it a retreat at all, telling reporters that the division is simply attacking toward the rear. Over 17 days, the column fights its way south through ambush after ambush, carrying wounded soldiers and frozen dead alongside them the whole way, until they reach the coast and evacuation ships. Survivors later called themselves the Chosen Few, a name still used at their reunions decades later. By the time the division reached the coast, more than 7,000 of Smith's own men had been lost to frostbite alone. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. How do a few hundred fighters with pistols and homemade bombs hold off an army with tanks? In April 1943, inside the Warsaw Ghetto in occupied Poland, German forces enter to begin the final deportation of the remaining Jewish residents to death camps. A resistance organization led by Mordecai Anielewicz, in his early 20s, has spent months smuggling in a small stockpile of pistols, grenades, and gasoline bottles through tunnels and sewer connections to the outside city. When German troops march in expecting no resistance, fighters strike from windows, rooftops, and underground bunkers, forcing an organized army to retreat from a civilian neighborhood on the first day. German commanders bring in tanks and eventually burn the ghetto block by block to root out the remaining fighters. Anielewicz dies in a bunker on Mila Street in early May, along with much of his remaining command, as German forces close in from every direction. His final letter, smuggled out 2 weeks earlier, says that Jewish self-defense has become a fact, whatever comes next. His body was never identified among the ruins. The Alamo. On February 23, 1836, around 200 Texan defenders under commanders including William Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett are inside a former mission in San Antonio when a Mexican army of several thousand under General Antonio López de Santa Anna arrives and surrounds the walls. Travis sends riders out with letters begging for reinforcements and promising never to surrender, but almost no help arrives in time. For 13 days, the defenders hold the mission under siege and occasional bombardment, and on the final morning, Mexican troops storm the compound from multiple sides before dawn. By sunrise, nearly every defender inside the walls is dead, including Travis, Bowie, and Crockett. Santa Anna expected the loss to break Texan resistance. Instead, the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," spread through Texas faster than his army could march, and volunteers poured into General Sam Houston's forces in the weeks that followed. 6 weeks later, at San Jacinto, Houston's army defeated Santa Anna's forces in under 20 minutes and won Texas independence. More Texans avenged the Alamo in 18 minutes at San Jacinto than had died defending it 13 days earlier. If you like this video, subscribe for more like it.